Thank you. So, hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a presentation about diffusion-based text-guided video editing. So, I would like to first introduce myself. I am a third-year PhD student at Georgia Institute of Technology and have almost completed my 2 years there under the supervision of founder Professor James Ray. I've been currently doing an internship at Adobe right now at California, San Jose, and I have been working on generative models for video applications, which includes tasks such as text-to-video generation, video editing, long-term video generation, and so on. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit today. So the outline of my presentation is we will first begin with recapping the generative modeling and recall the terminology and some of the high-level concepts. Then I will go into the diffusion models, what they are and what do we mean by diffusion modeling. Then I will introduce the task of text-guided video editing, and if time allows, we can discuss the future work and open questions in that area. So I would like to talk about generative modeling first, and let me open my laser pointer. Yes. So what do we mean by generative modeling? Basically, the life and our daily lives are full of data, and we as researchers want to model these data. And the data can be anything, like the text messages can be data, the documentations can be data, images, videos, anything can be data. In our case, to be more specific, let's keep it as the images, the image dataset as our data. And what we want to do is to model a dataset of images in such a way that this model can produce images or generate images at the end. And those generated images should be as close as possible to the original dataset that the model is trained on. So we can split the generative modeling into two phases, which we call as the training phase and the sampling phase. In the training phase, we train some generative model to learn the distribution of the data. Let's say we have a data set of horse images, and we would like the generative model to learn the distribution of these horses. And at the sampling time, given some random initial noise, we would like this model to generate some artificial horse images, which should look like realistically and as close as possible to the original data set we have or original observations. So there are four kind of categories we could say under generative modeling. And the first and I think well-known one is the generative adversarial networks, GANs. Basically here we have two models called as the generator and the discriminator. And what they try to do is basically the generator tries to produce an image as qualitatively good as possible or as realistic as possible, whereas discriminator tries to determine whether this image, the input of the discriminator, the image is real or fake. And using under some adversarial settings where the generator and discriminator fight each other, they both learn to generate a good image, and the discriminator becomes skilled in discriminating the image whether it's fake or real. Then the generator learns to produce a visually good image that can mimic the data set we have at the beginning. The second type of the models is likelihood-based methods. So this is a little bit different than the GAN-based methods because in this case we have we formulate the data set in terms of mathematical distributions, let's say. So what I mean by this is this. So in the image on the right side, So we can say that this histogram is our data. We did some experiment and we obtained such results, and we would like to learn a model that that fits into this distribution well. Let's say we use a Gaussian distribution with unknown mean and unknown variance. Then our task is to learn these mean and variance in a way that the likelihood of the chosen distribution fits well to the data we have. And the likelihood, you could think it as a measure of how well the distribution fits to our data set. So let's say if we took the mean as shown in this green image, then it will be the best fitting distribution compared to the other red Gaussian distributions. And the way the methods under this category works is by trying to minimizing the likelihood of the distributions we have given the data set. As a third approach, we can talk about energy-based methods, but I won't go into the details. But in a high level, a distribution is learned as an energy function. You can think it as a form of a probability distribution, and then it's normalized to become a probability function, and the model learns these energy function and tries to fit some function to our data set. And as the fourth approach, we can talk about the score-based methods. And here, instead of learning the original probability distribution, as we did in the third method in energy functions, which is really hard to do, it learns the score of the energy or the change of the likelihood given some direction using or modeled by a neural network. So basically, we have those four categories, and diffusion models have interpretations in likelihood-based methods and score-based methods, but I'm going to give some details about its likelihood-based method interpretation. So this is another illustration that shows how GANs, VAEs, which is one of the likelihood-based methods as well, and diffusion models look like. So in GANs, as I explained, we have a discriminator that tries to separate between a real image and a fake image, whereas the generator tries to generate an image from an initial noise. In VAEs, they have a different scheme using likelihood-based methods and diffusion models, which I will come into that in the next couple of slides. So basically, diffusion models are a probabilistic Markovian graphical models where each transition is represented by conditional probabilities. To be more specific or to make this a little bit more concrete, let's say we have a sample, an image of a dog, as shown in the X0. And the idea of diffusion models is that we have an unknown distribution, which is the data set, which is the set of images that we want to model. We gradually add Gaussian noise to the input to convert it into a known distribution. And theoretically, if we add enough Gaussian noises repeatedly to the input image, then what we obtain is a standard normal Gaussian distribution at the end, which is known distribution. So basically, we convert an unknown distribution into a known distribution by adding Gaussian noise iteratively. And then using some learnable methods like training a neural network or some other deep learning methods, we learn how to reverse this process, meaning that we learn how to perform sampling from the known distribution, the Gaussian standard noise, to an unknown distribution that we want to learn. Hence, the learning is done. So there are two concepts or two terms that we need to know in diffusion models called as the forward diffusion and reverse diffusion. In forward diffusion, the transitions are known because we add some predefined Gaussian noises to the inputs. In the reverse diffusion, this is this direction from right to left, where we convert a Gaussian pure noise into an image. The transitions are unknown, and they are parameterized by some model, and they are learned. So if you do the mathematics behind these concepts, what it boils down is this training illustration. So basically, in the training step, you sample an image from the data set. Then you sample a noise that corresponds to some time step t. Then you add this noise to this image and noisify the image given the time step t. Then what the learnable model tries to do is to predict, given the noisified image, it tries to predict the noise that you added at the beginning. And we use the L2 loss between the estimated noise and the original noise that we added to this sample image. And by minimizing this loss, we learn a parameterized model, which can be a deep learning model, an MLP model, a UNet model, something that you can use. And it learns the noise that is added at time step t. Using that scheme, we learn how to go from right to left. In other words, under these settings, after we perform a training, using that diffusion model, we can perform sampling one by one from x capital T to x capital T minus 1, and so on until x0, until we reach to the original image. So latent diffusion models took this and took one step forward to this approach, because in this approach we are using and processing the image, or we are processing everything in the pixel space, assuming that our domain is images. And because there are problems when we use in images, such as they are computationally expensive, because we are working in pixel space and we need computation power to process this high dimensional data. Instead, in latent diffusion models, they propose to first encode the image into some hidden embedding, then running the diffusion process in this hidden embedding, then decoding it back when the diffusion process is done, which speeds up the entire process, and which almost everybody is using who are working with the image or video space. So there are two more terms that I would like to also explain, called as the image inversion and image generation. So the green shows the image inversion, where there are some methods called as DDIM inversion, which allows us to invert an image into its latent space correspondence. What I meant by saying is, basically, if we invert an image to some noise correspondence, then what it means is we can generate the original image, or at least approximate or reconstruct it with very little errors, by using exactly the same noise we obtained using the image inversion method. So these are two terms that will be very useful to understand in video approaches. So let's come to the text-guided video editing task. So this shows a very basic baseline, or it's showing a high level idea of what it looks like. So basically, we have an input video. I will show the examples later. And we have a stable diffusion model, which is an example of a latent diffusion model I just explained. And it's conditioned on some text, let's say. And these stable diffusion models are able to invert an image and produce another image using different text conditions. You can perform some editing operations as well, meaning that given some input image and given some text description, they can invert the input image. Then during the inference time, during the sampling time, using that text condition, they can perform some editing in a way that the output image reflects the description that you gave as a condition, as a text prompt. And to extend this into a video editing task, what we can do as a baseline is So we know that video is a series of frames or series of images. We can process each independently, and we can give some text prompt to it and ask it to generate the edited video version. But the key challenges here is that we need to ensure that the temporal consistency is preserved, which is not in this case because we process each frame independently. And it will have some resource problems if we use use larger models. And there are still challenges in evaluating how well the models are working. So I'm going to explain a couple of approaches from literature, which are published in conferences. So the first one is the method called as pics to video. And so what they do is basically they first take a series of frames, the video, and the task here is to change the video in a way that it will reflect the text prompt that we want. And this is called as the text-guided video editing problem. So what we want here, what they do is to first invert each frame using an inversion method called as DDM inversion, and they take this as the initial noise for the denoising process. Then to edit each frame, they select a reference frame, and this is the first frame in the video in their approach, and inject the features of the diffusion models to the unit of the sampling process for the corresponding frame. And at each denoising step, they update the latents of the current frame such that the temporal consistency will be preserved along the entire video. There is another method called as the Fate Zero. And what they do is to basically process the entire video as a single batch, meaning that they process it using a diffusion model that is enhanced with the temporal attention layers, which means the temporal information is also processed throughout the inversion and sampling process. And what they discover is that if they use the attention features during the inversion process when they run the sampling, they claim that they preserve the structural and motion information better than the attention features used in only the sampling process. There's another method called re-render a video, which offers some pixel level changes and shape aware level changes, and they do some kind of architectural changes to keep the pixel level correspondences between frames as close as possible during the sampling step. And this is another method published in iClear 2024, token flow. So their motivation is different than the methods that I just passed through the previous approaches, in a way that they observe the features of the videos. So they basically assume that this is our original video and this is the edited video when we use Van Gogh as a text prompt, and this is done in a way where we process each frame independently using the baseline I just explained in the beginning. So they do some feature visualization, meaning that during the sampling process, they took out the features of the diffusion models, the UNet model, and they visualize it using some tricks. And as you can see in the original video, the features are consistent as it should be. But in per frame editing, there's flickering. There is no temporal consistency because of the inconsistency in the features, as they claimed. Then what they propose is to making sure that these features are consistent throughout the frame. And this is the basis of their work. So basically, they first invert the original video, get the noise correspondences of each frame. Then they extract the features of each frame using the UNet during inversion. and they compute the nearest neighbor field of each frames, meaning that assume we take the nose of the wolf and we find the corresponding patch of the nose of the wolf in all of the shots frames. And at the sampling time, we use the noisy video, the noise, then they sample some keyframes and use some architectural, use some layers called as extended attention and so on. These are just the details, but the key idea is this token flow propagation part, where they use this calculated correspondence field and use a linear interpolation between the features of the corresponding patches for the previous and later frames. And hence they ensure that the same level of feature consistency is ensured as in the original video features. So it gives temporally consistent videos using this approach. So I would like to also introduce our work, Rave, which deals with the same problem, text-guided video editing, and it's a better illustration showing what this problem is. So here we have an original video of a turtle swimming, and we use the Pokemon style text as the text condition, and we want this kind of a video. So yeah, our approach is a fast zero-shot framework for this task, and it's compatible with any off-the-shelf pre-trained text-to-image diffusion models, and it supports videos of any length, in contrast with the previous approaches, because previous approaches are limited by the length or duration of the video, and they cannot process videos of longer durations, let's say, because they require more resources as the number of frames increases. Yeah, so the motivation of our work comes from a phenomenon called as the grid trick, which is also known as the character sheet, and which is a popular hack in the art community. So this approach allows for applying a consistent style to all images in a grid using a text-to-image stable diffusion as shown in this figure. Basically, as illustrated in this red box, when the model is provided with conditions such as these lines at the pause of each frame, and when we feed this through the diffusion model, given this detailed text prompt, it can produce a grid where each generated character remains consistent across all sections. And the effectiveness of this simple method in creating multiple images with a consistent style lies in the fact that how the diffusion model edits a single grid. Then we thought about how we can extend this grid trick for zero-shot video editing, because if our video consists of 9 frames, then we can just use this grid trick to have temporally consistent video. So we can process the grids independently. We can adapt this trick for video editing by transforming the frames into a grid layout and feeding this grid into a text-to-AI editing tool, which is a stable diffusion model in our case. But the modified grid is unfolded into separate frames and sequenced to produce the final video. But maintaining consistency in longer videos is challenging because we need to have a larger grid as the number of frames increases, which is challenging because of the GPU memory constraints, and it limits the number of frames per grid. For example, if we use a GPU that can only handle 9 frames, longer videos must be split into multiple grids, resulting in internal inconsistency, as shown in this figure. As you can see, the color of the atmosphere and the car is changing after each 9 frames. Then what we can do is to adapt a different attention mechanism used called as the sparse causal attention. But it's still limited because from the beginning to the end, there is a slight change in the color and some parts of the car, and it still struggles to maintain the consistency as the video gets longer. Therefore, to achieve consistency, we proposed Rave, a novel noise shuffling approach that ensures styling across independent grids. So what we basically do is that we take an input video, and it starts with pre-processing the input video by obtaining the relevant conditions, the depth maps in our case, and the DDIM inversions, the noise correspondences of each frames independently. Then the grid structure is formed for the pre-processed videos, the condition grids and the latent grids. So we just convert this video in a format that includes set of grids. Then instead of processing each grid in the latent grids sequentially to produce the final video, which yields undesirable results as we have seen in the previous slide, our approach involves randomly shuffling the order of frames at each time step. So basically we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes like that in a sequential way in this set of grids. But at each denoising step during the inference time, we just randomly shuffle the ordering of the frames. And it the shuffle function is shown here, and it basically rearranges the locations of frames within this given set of grids. By randomly forming these grids, we encourage the spatial temporal interaction between each frame throughout the denoising process. At the beginning, I showed that the grid feeding a grid into a diffusion model works well within the grid, but it doesn't work well for the frames that are out of the grid. But in this way, we just we flow the interaction across the grids, and hence we maintain the spatio-temporal interaction between each frame. So here we show some qualitative examples of a wolf. An input video is transformed into different videos, a white cat, a dinosaur, or a futuristic wolf accordingly. And we have different type of qualitative results where we have an input video and the text prompt requires some fine details in the output video, which is done using our method, as can be seen in those examples. And here you can also see some comparisons to the baselines I talked about at the beginning, where we have a video of a bear, and this is our method, and these are the approaches that we taught. So in this comparison, this is our approach is shown to be superior to the other approaches. So as a feature work, the part I explained is mostly about text-guided video editing, but people are still working on different kind of tasks, including image to video, film generation, and the other ones that are written as bullet lists. So image to video, so all the examples I talked about is text-guided video editing, but in this this category, we are given a reference image, let's say a picture of mine, and I would like to generate a video of mine given that reference image. Or in film generation, as we all know, films contain different scenes with the same character, and people are working on how to generate different shots or different scenes using the same character identity or preserving the identity of the same character throughout the video, which is also relevant to the task of long-term video generation. And video extension is a different task that includes extending a given video, and those all approaches require some GPU computation or some, they are both time intensive and resource intensive operations. That's why a branch of researchers are working on how we can speed up the inference steps and Hence, they are working on real-time video editing problems and video tasks. And yeah, here are my references, and thank you all for listening.
Fantastic. So we do have a couple of questions. The first one came in from Jim at the very beginning of your presentation, and his question seems a little bit more generalized, is when sampling video data for training, how do you choose which frames to sample?
Actually, the approaches I have shown are they do not require any training or fine-tuning, but they are zero-shot methods. So basically, we have a pre-trained diffusion model, and this diffusion model was trained on image data set. And in those examples, we are only using the diffusion model that was trained on images, and these methods try to find a way to adapt this text to image model into a video editing task. That's why they are called as zero-shot video editing methods, actually.
And then we have a question that came up near the end of your presentation from Yash, who asks, when you shuffle the frames, does this put a limit on the number of frames you can process to get it processed quickly?
Yeah, actually, like if you use longer durations, like let's say 500s of frames, then of course you need to, the only way you can manage is by increasing the size of the grid, which can be limited by the GPU we are using. But compared to the ability of previous approaches, it's still fine to use just 3 by 3 grids, which fits to GPU of 24 gigabytes, and it still gives comparable or superior results compared to previous approaches. So for immensely long videos, it can be an issue, but for videos that are used in the data sets, it's fine.
And then we have one final question from an anonymous attendee. Are you able to speak to any of the research going on for 3D object generation for AR and VR use cases?
Yeah, actually, it is a different domain, and it's a huge domain where many people I know are working on 3D generation, and there are different kind of problems in that domain as well. For example, one problem I know is to generate the 3D object using a 2D image of an object, or there are different problems like 3D editing, meaning that editing the texture and the appearance of the 3D object given some text description or referenced by an image, or so on. There are plenty of tasks in 3D generation era as well.
And then we'll take one last question before we have to move on. But Haresh asks in the webinar chat, does editing the weather or time of the day work when there are multiple vehicles and a diverse scene, preserving the details?
Yes, actually, we tried such examples by trying to change the weather or the background appearance, and it worked well. Maybe I can just quickly share a couple of results from our web page as well. So yeah, for example, maybe these can be some examples for the question. As you can see, we have the input videos on the left column, and we have the text description shown on top of the images. And as you can see, the background is also changing accordingly, given the text prompts.